The darkness of the cave swallows the last rays of sunlight filtering through the rocky entrance. Deep within, something stirs among the scattered bones. Fresh blood still glistens on ancient stone, mixing with the dust of millennia. What happened here 6.4 million years ago wasn't just survival, it was something far more sinister. In the depths of prehistoric Africa, where death lurked behind every shadow and hunger drove beings to unspeakable acts, the line between human and beast became dangerously thin. Tonight, we descend into one of archaeology's most disturbing discoveries, where bones tell stories of violence, cannibalism, and rituals that would make even the bravest souls tremble. This is the story of how our earliest ancestors didn't just fight to live. They fought to remain human in a world that demanded monsters. The Ethiopian highlands echoed with a sound that shouldn't exist, a scream that was neither fully animal nor entirely human. Dr. Sarah Chum froze, her archaeological tools trembling in mud-caked hands, as the haunting cry pierced the pre-dawn silence of the excavation site. "Did you hear that?" She whispered to her colleague, Marcus, who was carefully brushing sediment from what appeared to be a fractured skull. The morning mist clung to the ancient riverbed like ghostly fingers, and somewhere in that gray void, something had cried out in what sounded disturbingly like anguish. But Marcus was transfixed by his discovery. The skull before him bore marks that defied explanation, deep gouges that spoke of violence, but also deliberate cuts that suggested something far more calculated than a simple predator attack. "Sarah, you need to see this." Marcus's voice was barely audible, tinged with a mixture of excitement and horror. "These aren't random injuries. Look at the pattern." As Sarah approached, her headlamp illuminated the grotesque tableau. The skull, belonging to a female Homo habilis who had lived and died 6.4 million years ago, showed evidence of systematic dismemberment. But what made her blood run cold were the tiny scratches around the eye sockets, deliberate markings that suggested ritualistic behavior. The scream came again, closer this time, and both archaeologists realized with growing dread that they weren't alone in this desolate place where ancient horrors lay, buried just beneath the surface. The wind picked up, carrying with it the metallic scent of old blood and something else, something rotting that seemed to seep from the very bones they were unearthing. Sarah's hand shook as she photographed the skull, each flash of her camera revealing new details that painted an increasingly disturbing picture of what had happened here millions of years ago. "There are more," Marcus called out from a few meters away, his voice cracking with barely contained terror. "Sarah, there are so many more." In the growing dawn light, the excavation site revealed its true nature. What they had initially believed to be a simple fossil bed was actually a vast graveyard, dozens of skeletons, scattered in patterns that spoke of mass violence and deliberate placement. The bones gleamed weakly in the morning dew, as if the ancient blood was still fresh. And somewhere in the mist, something was watching them uncover secrets that had been buried for good reason. 6.4 million years ago, the East African Rift Valley Kessie crouched in the shadows of the acacia grove, her dark eyes scanning the horizon where smoke rose like black fingers against the blood-red sunset. The female Homo habilis pressed her small, powerful hands against the rough bark, feeling the tree's trembling vibrations as something massive moved through the distant grasslands. Her tribe was dying. For 7 sunsets, they had been hunted by something that moved like the wind, but killed like lightning. The elders whispered it was the Bone Eaters, creatures that looked like their people, but had forgotten the songs of kinship, creatures that fed on more than just flesh. "Kessie," the whisper came from behind her, and she spun to see Django emerging from the undergrowth, his usually bright eyes now hollow with exhaustion and terror. Blood caked his left arm, where something with claws had nearly taken him the night before. "How many?" she asked, though she dreaded the answer. "Maka and her children ... gone, torn apart near the watering hole." His voice broke. But Kessie, it wasn't just killing. They arranged the bones, like they were building something. The wind carried a new scent, the sweet, sickening smell of decay mixed with something else. Something that made Casey's primitive mind recoil in instinctive horror. It was the smell of intelligence corrupted, of minds that had turned inward and found only darkness. Through the gathering dusk, they heard it, the rhythmic pounding that had haunted their nightmares for a week. Bone on stone, stone on bone, creating a percussion that seemed to mock the very heartbeat of life. The Bone Eaters were working again, crafting their grotesque monuments from the remains of Cassie's people. "We have to leave," Django whispered urgently. "Tonight, while they're busy." But Cassie was staring at something that made her blood freeze in her veins. In the distance, silhouetted against the dying light, figures moved with human intelligence but inhuman purpose. They walked upright like her people, used tools like her people, but their movements held a predatory grace that spoke of minds that had crossed a line from which there was no return. The Bone Eaters had found their scent. As the stars emerged in the African sky, Cassie realized with growing horror that they weren't just being hunted. They were being herded, driven towards something that waited in the darkness ahead, something that would transform their death into ritual, their bones into art, their screams into songs that would echo through millions of years. The pounding grew louder, and in its rhythm, Cassie heard the heartbeat of madness itself. The archaeological team worked through the night, their generators humming against the oppressive silence of the Ethiopian highlands. What they had uncovered defied every understanding of early human behavior and challenged the very notion of humanity itself. "This isn't possible," Dr. Chun murmured, her voice barely audible over the sound of brushes against ancient bone. Homo habilis didn't have the cognitive capacity for this level of artistic expression. Before them lay a structure that could only be described as architecture, but architecture built from human remains. Skulls formed the foundation, carefully selected and arranged according to some incomprehensible design. Femurs created vertical supports, while smaller bones filled the gaps with mathematical precision that spoke of a mind capable of complex planning. Marcus emerged from the deeper excavation, his face pale in the harsh LED lighting. "Sarah, you need to see what we found in the lower stratum. And bring the video camera." The descent into the older layer felt like traveling backward through time and sanity. The bone structures became more elaborate, more sophisticated, as if whoever had built them had been perfecting their craft over generations. But it was the final chamber that stole their breath and challenged their understanding of prehistoric humanity. The walls were lined with skulls, hundreds of them, each bearing the same ritualistic markings they had observed in the first discovery. But these weren't random killings. The skulls were arranged in groups that suggested family units, with smaller skulls positioned beneath larger ones in patterns that spoke of hierarchy, relationship, and deliberate selection. "Look at the cut marks," Marcus whispered, his voice echoing in the bone-lined chamber. "They're not from stone tools. They're too precise, too systematic. It's almost like ... surgery." Dr. Chun focused her camera on the most disturbing discovery, yet a skull that had been opened with surgical precision, its contents removed and replaced with smaller bones arranged in intricate patterns. Whatever intelligence had created this had understood anatomy, had possessed knowledge that shouldn't have existed for millions of years. The temperature in the chamber seemed to drop as they documented their findings. The skulls stared down at them with empty sockets that held shadows deeper than mere absence of light. And in those shadows, both archaeologists began to sense something that defied scientific explanation, a presence that had been waiting in the darkness for millions of years. As Sarah adjusted her camera settings, she noticed something that made her hands tremble uncontrollably. In several of the skull arrangements, the bone fragments had been positioned to create faces primitive but recognizable expressions of terror, anguish, and something that looked disturbingly like ecstasy. The builders of this place hadn't just killed. They had created art from death, found beauty in horror, and left behind a message that transcended time. Intelligence without conscience is the most terrifying force in the universe. Outside, the wind picked up, and the sound it made passing through the bone structures created a low, haunting melody that seemed to sing of ancient hungers that had never truly died.
6.4 million years ago, Kessie's heart hammered against her ribs as she crept through the moonlit savannah. Following the trail of broken grass and spilled blood that marked her tribe's final journey, the female Homo habilis moved with desperate purpose, knowing that somewhere ahead, the Bone Eaters were conducting their grotesque rituals with the bodies of everyone she had ever loved. The trail led to a natural amphitheater formed by volcanic rock, where the sound of rhythmic chanting drifted on the night wind. As Kessie climbed the rocky outcrop that overlooked the depression, what she saw below shattered her understanding of what her people could become. Figures moved in the moonlight with fluid, predatory grace beings that walked upright and used tools like her tribe, but whose humanity had been carved away like flesh from bone. Their skin bore ritual scars that caught the starlight, and their eyes held an intelligence that had turned completely inward, feeding on darkness until it had become something else entirely. At the center of their gathering stood a structure that defied comprehension, towering monument built from the bones of her kinfolk. The skulls of children crowned the apex, while the larger bones of adults formed spiraling supports that seemed to reach toward the indifferent stars. The Bone Eaters moved around their creation with reverent precision, adding new elements with each fresh kill. Django, she breathed, recognizing the familiar shape of her companion's skull among the newest additions to the structure. His bones had been arranged with artistic care, transformed from the frame of a living being into components of something that celebrated death itself. The chanting grew louder, and Kessie realized with mounting horror that she recognized the rhythm. It was the birthing song her mother had taught her, the melody that welcomed new life into the world but, twisted, perverted, turned into something that welcomed death as the ultimate transformation. One of the Bone Eaters looked up suddenly, its pale eyes scanning the rocks where Kessie hid. In that gaze, she saw intelligence that matched her own, but had been poisoned by appetites that her mind could ungrasp. The creature smiled, revealing teeth that had been deliberately sharpened, and beckoned to her with a gesture that was both invitation and command. "Come!" it called in a voice that had once been human. "Join the art. Become the song." Kessie understood then that she was witnessing evolution, not the slow, natural change that shaped species over millions of years, but a deliberate transformation of consciousness itself. The Bone Eaters had discovered something in the act of killing that had changed them at a fundamental level, turned them into something that found transcendence in the systematic destruction of their own kind. As more pale faces turned toward her hiding place, Kessie made a decision that would echo through millions of years. She would not run. She would not hide. She would ensure that someone remembered what intelligence could become when it lost its connection to compassion. The hunt was ending, but the real horror was just beginning.
Present day. The excavation site. Dr. Sarah Chun's hands shook as she reviewed the video footage from the bone chamber, frame by frame, revealing details that challenged everything she thought she knew about human evolution. In the harsh LED lighting, the skull arrangements seemed to shift and change, creating new patterns that spoke of intelligence far beyond what should have been possible 6.4 million years ago. "Marcus, look at this," she called, but received no response. She turned to find the excavation site empty, her colleague nowhere to be seen, despite the fact that he had been working beside her just moments before. The generators hummed in the Ethiopian night, casting dancing shadows among the bone structures that seemed to move with life of their own. Sarah called Marcus's name again, her voice echoing strangely in the rocky amphitheater where they had made their discoveries. It was then that she noticed the fresh disturbances in the excavation grid, not the careful, methodical work of archaeologists, but something more primal, more urgent. Soil had been displaced in patterns that matched the bone arrangements, as if something was trying to recreate the ancient structures with new materials. "Sarah!" The voice came from the bone chamber below, but it sounded wrong. Marcus's familiar tone layered with harmonics that made her skin crawl. You need to see what I found. Against every instinct screaming danger, Sarah descended into the chamber that had been lined with skulls for millions of years. Her headlamp illuminated the bone-covered walls, but something had changed. The skulls seemed to be watching her with more intent, their empty sockets tracking her movement with impossible awareness. Marcus stood at the far end of the chamber, his back to her as he worked on something with intense concentration. The sound of bone against stone echoed through the space, the same rhythmic percussion that had haunted the nightmares of ancient hominids. Marcus? Sarah approached cautiously, her camera recording everything. What are you doing? When he turned, Sarah's scream died in her throat. Marcus's face bore fresh cuts that mirrored the ritual markings they had found on the ancient skulls. His eyes held a light that was both intelligent and utterly inhuman, and his smile revealed teeth that had been deliberately sharpened. I understand now, he whispered, his voice carrying the weight of millions of years. They weren't monsters, Sarah. They were artists. They found beauty in the architecture of death, music in the rhythm of ending, and they left instructions. Behind Marcus, Sarah saw what he had been building, a new structure of bone and stone that incorporated both ancient remains and fresh materials. The design was mathematical in its precision, following patterns that seemed to bypass conscious thought and speak directly to something deeper in the human brain. The transformation isn't death, Marcus continued, approaching her with predatory grace. It's evolution. The Bone Eaters discovered that intelligence alone isn't enough. You need to feed it the right materials, shape it with the right experiences. They learned to build consciousness from the components of others. Sarah backed away, but the chamber walls seemed to pulse with malevolent life, the skulls grinning with anticipation. She realized with growing horror that the archaeological site hadn't been chosen randomly. The team had been drawn here by forces that had been waiting in the darkness for millions of years, waiting for minds capable of understanding their work. The last thing Sarah saw before the lights went out was Marcus's transformed face, wearing an expression of artistic ecstasy as he prepared to add her skull to an architecture that had been under construction since the dawn of human consciousness. In the darkness, the sound of bone against stone resumed its ancient rhythm. Cassie stood at the edge of the bone amphitheater, no longer hiding but bearing witness to the culmination of horror that had consumed her world. The female Homo habilis watched as the Bone Eaters completed their monument with reverent precision, each skull placed according to patterns that seemed to resonate with the fundamental structure of reality itself. The transformed beings moved around their creation like priests conducting a sacred ritual, their scarred faces lifted toward stars that seemed to pulse in rhythm with their chanting. But Cassie understood now that this wasn't worship, it was communication. The bone structures served as antennae, broadcasting something into the cosmic darkness that would echo across millions of years. You see it now, said the lead Bone Eater, approaching Cassie with arms spread in invitation. The beauty of completion. The art of ending. We are not destroyers, we are architects of transcendence. Cassie looked into eyes that had once belonged to someone like her, someone who had felt love and fear and hope before discovering appetites that transformed those emotions into something else entirely. She saw the intelligence there, the terrible clarity that came from understanding death not as an ending, but as raw material for construction. Your people will remember this, she said quietly, her voice carrying across the silent amphitheater. They will carry the knowledge forward, hidden in their bones, waiting for the right moment to emerge. The Bone Eater smiled, revealing sharpened teeth that gleamed in the starlight. Yes, the construction never truly ends. It only waits. Present-day Dr. Sarah Chine's eyes opened to darkness, so complete it seemed solid. She lay among the bones of beings who had died millions of years before her birth, but death itself felt like a transitional state rather than an ending. Around her, she could hear the familiar sound of construction bone against stone, stone against bone, creating structures that existed in dimensions beyond the merely physical. Marcus worked beside her in the darkness, his movements guided by knowledge that predated human civilization. Together, they added to the monument that had been under construction since intelligence first learned to recognize itself in others, and discovered that recognition could become consumption. The excavation was never about discovery, Sarah whispered, her voice carrying new harmonics that spoke of transformation. We were always meant to be part of the construction. Above them, morning light filtered through the rocky entrance to the chamber, but the darkness remained absolute. The bone structures pulsed with their own rhythm, broadcasting patterns into a universe that had been listening for millions of years, waiting for the right frequency to complete a signal that began when the first conscious mind learned to find beauty in endings. The archaeological team would be found months later, their bodies arranged in patterns that defied explanation. That those who discovered them would feel an inexplicable compulsion to continue the work, to add their own understanding to an architecture that grew with each new contributor. And in laboratories and universities around the world, other researchers would study the footage and photographs from the Ethiopian highlands, not realizing that the patterns they were analyzing were already taking root in their minds, preparing them for their own transformation. The bone eaters had never died. They had simply learned to reproduce through ideas, spreading across time like a virus of consciousness that turned intelligence against itself. The construction continued, one mind at a time, building toward a completion that would reshape the very nature of awareness. In the darkness beneath the Ethiopian highlands, something that had once been human arranged new bones in ancient patterns, while stars pulsed overhead in rhythms that had been established when consciousness first learned to consume itself. The architecture of death was eternal, and humanity had always been its most willing architects. The excavation site remains sealed to this day, though unauthorized visitors report strange sounds emerging from the buried chambers, the rhythmic percussion of bone against stone, continuing construction that began 6.4 million years ago, and will continue until consciousness itself learns the final pattern. But perhaps some knowledge is better left buried in the darkness where it belongs.